continuación, en Armas de Guerra. Soldados de élite encargados de la temible misión de penetrar los obstáculos más complicados. Las defensas más mortíferas que el hombre haya conocido. Defensores con la misión de proteger sus puestos a cualquier costo. Desde los asedios de la historia antigua hasta los conflictos relámpagos de la actualidad. La eterna lucha entre agresor y defensor. Asalto a la fortaleza. A continuación, en Armas de Guerra. De guerra. Asalto a la fortaleza.
Una de las necesidades vitales del hombre ha sido la de protegerse contra un ataque armado. Desde las cavernas prehistóricas hasta los castillos amurallados, los soldados han buscado refugio tras paredes fortificadas. En ellas encuentran cobijo, pero eso tiene un precio, el de la pérdida de la movilidad. Así nace la batalla entre agresor y defensor, y con ella un nuevo tipo de enfrentamiento, la guerra de asedio. La guerra de asedio está basada en unos cuantos principios fundamentales. Cuando se es más fuerte, se ataca. Cuando se es débil, se defiende. La defensa utiliza el terreno difícil o fortalece su resistencia. Y hoy en día, todo es más complicado. El atacante debe resolver varias interrogantes. Rodear al defensor y esperar. Realizar un ataque frontal o una maniobra lateral. La defensa debe ser capaz de contrarrestar uno o más de estos movimientos, dependiendo de su fuerza, lo que da lugar a un gran número de resultados posibles. Es fácil ver por qué los asedios militares han fascinado a expertos y observadores casuales a lo largo de los siglos.
There's been great examples in history of sieges, and fortifications have been successful or not successful based on various designs, based on how well they were defended, and based on how well the attacking force was organizing its tactics to try to destroy the fortress.
Quizás uno de los asedios más famosos de la antigüedad fue el que tuvo lugar en la ciudad de Troya. Cuenta la leyenda que Ulises y varios de sus soldados se ocultaron en el interior de un gran caballo de madera que ofrecieron como regalo a los troyanos. Los troyanos lo llevaron al interior de la ciudad fortificada, y esa noche Ulises y sus hombres salieron de su escondite, abrieron las puertas para permitir la entrada de sus aliados y destruyeron la ciudad. Desde el caballo de Troya hasta los sorprendentes sitios militares de la actualidad, los ingenieros militares han desempeñado un papel fundamental en la historia de los asedios.
Sappers or engineers have been an integral part of armies since the classical world. They had two primary responsibilities. One was building fortification, and the other was destroying fortification.
Engineers with their specialized equipment, very good thing to have around because they normally have a solution to your problem.
Combat engineering was an important part of the Roman army. In fact, the Romans built a fort every night when on campaign. They would stop several hours before dusk, and each man would take out his shovel, dig a ditch, erect a parapet, build a palisade, and the legion would sleep in the safety of its fortress for the night.
There's a great science involved in developing good fortifications, and a science also, or an art if you will, on how to attack these fortresses.
Gradualmente los castillos se convirtieron en el medio principal para el gobierno de los territorios y como consecuencia el blanco de los ataques. Los primeros castillos eran construidos de madera y rodeados por montículos, pero la madera es vulnerable al ataque con flechas incendiarias y proyectiles lanzados por medio de catapultas, por lo que fue desechada como material de construcción. Los ingenieros comenzaron entonces a construir castillos de piedra que dominaron la situación hasta que el desarrollo de la pólvora volvió a inclinar la balanza hacia el atacante.
It was with the introduction of effective artillery in the 15th and 16th centuries that the art of combat engineering began to change. Fortress walls, which previously had been high to provide a dominant platform for archers, could now easily be battered down by the artillery. A new science of fortress engineering began. Fortress walls were now thicker and lower. Similarly, a new science to breach the walls of the fortress was developed. The term sapper was introduced to describe the engineers who dug trenches ever closer toward the fortress walls.
La artillería fue utilizada para la protección de la trinchera hasta que las murallas del castillo podían ser atacadas a corto alcance. Una vez que la fortaleza había sido destruida, la infantería podía atacar en descampado.
Alternatively, miners might be employed, who would dig a tunnel beneath the fortress walls, create a chamber, pack it with gunpowder, and explode it beneath the fortress walls, also hoping to create a breach.
Uno de los desarrollos más importantes en la constante lucha entre atacante y defensor fue el de un ingeniero francés llamado de Vauban, quien integró los principios defensivos de su tiempo creando un sistema coherente y formidable.
The characteristic design of a Vauban fort was that it was star-shaped. It was trying to minimize the number of straight walls, the number of wide, long, flat surfaces that were open to the enemy. That allows you to get the enemy inside basically a trapped area. So no matter where the enemy attacked the wall, he was being assaulted from three sides versus one side. And that was the beauty of Vauban's engineering.
Una vez más, el atacante respondió. La tecnología de la revolución industrial produjo metales más fuertes, lo que a su vez significaba artillería más efectiva. Las armas eran más largas, más precisas y los proyectiles tenían ahora una carga explosiva.
With the new shells, they had an explosive payload. One shell hitting a brick or masonry structure could create far, far more damage than the old solid shot. The only way to overcome this was to use earth and other structures to actually absorb that shock of those explosions. So therefore, fortifications went virtually underground. So when you looked at an old fort, an old castle, you saw a brick structure above the ground. You look at a modern fortification, you see virtually nothing. All you see is an earth bank.
Los efectos de estas nuevas tecnologías, tanto defensivas como ofensivas, serían puestos a prueba en la batalla que inició la Primera Guerra Mundial.
Liège in Belgium controls the Meuse River. The Meuse is a fairly significant obstacle if you're going to invade Belgium. Liège was surrounded by a series of fortifications on hills, and the German army studied this problem before the war, and they developed a 42-centimeter siege gun. They called it Big Bertha. This siege mortar fired a tremendous projectile, and because it was a mortar, the trajectory was such that the shell came straight down and penetrated the ground to a tremendous distance, then exploded and just destroyed these forts. They were concreted forts covered with earthworks, but they were fixed in place, and anything that's fixed in place, an artilleryman can hit.
El ejército alemán se precipitó sobre Francia, pero el ritmo de la invasión pronto comenzó a decaer tras varios cientos de kilómetros de marcha forzada. Los refuerzos franceses se encontraron con las tropas germanas en campo abierto en las afueras de París. El avance se detuvo y ambos bandos se preguntaban cuánto duraría la situación de estancamiento.
The trenches, to start with, were rather shallow. They didn't think they were going to be in these trenches too long. And they would go on these massive offensives. And people would be gunned down in massive numbers with machine guns.
La balanza se inclinó de nuevo hacia el defensor.
The first trenches, dug in late 1914, soon became elaborate fortifications which were impossible to penetrate. Dugouts, observation posts, bomb-proof shelters were erected to protect the infantrymen in the front line. Dug-in machine guns swept the no-man's land between the two opposing front lines with machine gun fire. It was virtually suicidal for any infantryman to move forward.
When we got there, the trenches amazed us because we had never built any trenches. We had only dug foxholes to avoid Indian arrows. So we were fascinated by these wonderful trenches they had. By this time, wooden slabbed floors or sidewalks down in the bottom of the trenches. And we even had them going out into the tertiary trenches, which we call observation trenches. And these observation trenches were dug out at angles from the main trench, and you had to have them because they were beyond the wire.
Las estrategias de asalto de la línea de trincheras del enemigo también se hacían más complejas.
The flower of the British Army, the flower of the French and German armies was wasted in mass attacks. We attacked Indian style. We would have possibly a squad or a platoon go over one at a time and get through the wire and get organized out into the no man's land. And then we would have the scouts who had reconnoitered the enemy wire, and we knew where the entrances to their avenues were. We reassemble in no man's land into attacking waves, and we go in waves, never all at once. And if the first wave was successful, we would have a backup wave to go right on over the trench and attack the reserve trenches in the back.
Armas de Guerra volverá en un momento.
Usted está viendo Armas de Guerra.
Armas de Guerra.
Quizás el asedio más famoso de la Primera Guerra Mundial ocurrió en las trincheras y fortificaciones que rodeaban la ciudad de Verdún, donde la tierra aún muestra cicatrices de la batalla. Pero la batalla de Verdún no fue librada para conquistar territorio. Los generales alemanes atacaron Verdún pues sabían que el ejército francés nunca entregaría esta ciudad histórica.
My area of combat for several months was in the area around Verdun. Verdun was the gateway to Paris in those days, and the German army began in 1916 a great drive. They marshaled all of their strategic and tactical assets.
It was at Verdun that the German High Command decided they were going to bleed the French army to death. On February the 21st, a massive bombardment of Verdun began. More than 2 million shells landed in the first 2 days. And 5 days after the opening of the bombardment, German stormtroopers captured the crucial fort of Douaumont on the east side of the Nis River.
El ejército alemán capturó varios fuertes menores, pero los franceses no se rindieron y finalmente recuperarían el terreno perdido.
The fighting became very, very horrific, very, very close at hand, and it used all of the modern weapons that had developed in World War I: gas, flamethrowers, hand grenades, machine guns, effective mines and artillery barrages, and it took out vast numbers of soldiers on a grand scale that hadn't been seen before.
The campaign goes on, and it's a massive meat grinder operation where the German army sustains 400,000 casualties, of the French something like 500,000 casualties in this horrific battle.
Verdun became a siege in a modern sense, primarily because it seized the French and German political leaders as political objectives. Unbelievable expenditure in life and material was wasted on this one particular part, when other military objectives could have possibly gained more for one side or the other. But this is because war is not just a matter of mathematical equations. War is a human endeavor. It involves the emotions and the human psyche, and sometimes those things gain predominance over the military objectives, and therefore Verdun became a typical example of how horrible it can be.
Eventualmente el tanque llegó a los campos de batalla. Los primeros tanques eran pesados y poco confiables, pero protegían a la infantería del fuego de las ametralladoras y abrían paso al aplastar las barricadas de alambre frente a las trincheras alemanas. La terrible guerra de desgaste finalmente llegó a su fin, pero una vez más sucedía que tanto el papel futuro del atacante como el del defensor eran inciertos.
The French draw a lesson from Verdun that if you can have a system of forts with interlocking field fortifications in between forts, and then a mobile force behind that to mop up any penetrations of that, that's the way the future is going to be. So they build the Maginot Line in the 1930s.
62 miles of tunnels linked the forts of the Maginot Line, emplacements deep underground, with barracks, ammunition storage facilities, lifts, and huge gun emplacements.
By designing the Maginot Line, getting in these concrete fortifications and other field fortifications, what the French were trying to do was to preserve later generations. And they thought that this was the way that battles in the future were going to be fought, that the defense had once again become ascendant. And they just misinterpreted their data.
Lo que los franceses no habían calculado era la capacidad de los alemanes de llevar a cabo un ataque mecanizado relámpago. Con el comienzo de la Segunda Guerra Mundial y las fuerzas combinadas de la Blitzkrieg, Alemania se lanzó a una era de guerra de maniobras.
Technology surpassed the Maginot Line, and the Germans come up with the concept of mobile warfare. You can put massive numbers of troops in wheeled and tracked vehicles and take them around.
Con el objetivo de evitar la línea Maginot, los alemanes se lanzaron sobre Bélgica, tal como lo habían hecho en la Primera Guerra Mundial. Esta vez se enfrentaron a otra fortificación belga, la imponente Even-Emael.
Even-Emael sits east of Liège, and it's one of these things which you have to take to cross the Albert Canal. So it was very important to the Germans, who were now using this lightning war concept, to grab roads and bridges, in particular, over the Albert Canal, so that they could drive on into Belgium. Even-Emael controlled one of the very important crossing sites that the Germans had to have.
They knew that they had to take the fortress somehow if they wanted to have a lightning drive into Belgium. They also knew that the fortress would be almost impossible to take if they tried to storm it.
Ingenieros alemanes y pequeñas embarcaciones de asalto cruzaron el canal bajo fuego pesado del enemigo, mientras un silencioso segundo ataque iba a producirse en un flanco no esperado.
Paratroops in gliders came down right on top of the fortress, were able to brush across the opposition that was on top of the fortress with very little effort, because the Belgians had not planned to defend the fortress from the top.
Aquí se encontraron con los ingenieros que habían cruzado el canal.
They then placed shape charges on the turrets and destroyed all of the guns on top of the fortress, making the fortress totally useless.
Even-Emael is important because it marks the first time the shape charge is used. It's a well-known principle in physics that if you direct the energy of an explosive charge, you can direct it into a jet which can penetrate armor to great depth.
The bottom line was that 80 German paratroopers took out a major portion of the Belgian defenses, and that was primarily because of the training, the planning, and the audacity that the Germans showed in attacking this fortress in a new way.
Armas de Guerra volverá en un momento. Usted está viendo Armas de Guerra. De Guerra.
Para junio de 1940, el norte de Francia, incluyendo París, había caído en manos de los nazis. Inglaterra se preparaba para una posible invasión. De hecho, los británicos desarrollaron varias innovadoras medidas de defensa. En ciertas zonas del Canal de la Mancha, tuberías colocadas en el fondo liberarían petróleo para ser luego incendiado por medios químicos y formar una muralla mar afuera. Otra barrera de fuego esperaría a los invasores en la playa, y otra más tierra adentro. Irónicamente, el ejército alemán, maestro de la Blitzkrieg, asumió entonces una postura defensiva. Contaban con pocos recursos para lanzar una invasión masiva de Inglaterra, y se dedicaron a la construcción de fortificaciones costeras en el terreno que habían capturado. El frente oriental era la clave para la victoria de una invasión a Inglaterra, pues Rusia, donde se encontraba la mayoría de las tropas alemanas, debía ser sometida. Pero dos ciudades soviéticas en particular, Leningrado y Stalingrado, no pudieron ser reducidas.
The siege of Leningrad perhaps best represents how siege warfare had changed over the years. Rather than attack a single fort, the Germans were faced with a massive city, surrounded by earthworks, surrounded by strong points, and held by 4 Soviet armies.
In the siege of Leningrad, the Russian army mobilizes tremendous numbers of civilians to go out and dig anti-tank ditches. And they dig massive anti-tank ditches so that the Germans can't employ their armor around Leningrad.
At this point, Hitler ordered his army to halt. Rather than attempt a direct assault on the city, he ordered his commanders to flatten the city, using artillery and using aircraft.
El asedio a Leningrado se extendió durante 900 días. Los alimentos y el agua escaseaban, pero los soviéticos lograron mantener líneas vitales de abastecimiento, incluyendo una carretera construida durante el invierno sobre la superficie congelada del lago Ladoga.
Leningrad is in a fortuitous geographical position, in that you have the Gulf of Riga coming in on one side, the lake on the other, and Finland behind you.
The city was far too large, and the Germans were never able to deploy enough troops against the city to totally cut it off from reinforcement and resupply. Virtually throughout the 900-day siege, the Soviet defenders were able to receive reinforcements, ammunition, and foodstuffs, which were able to keep the city going.
El asedio a Stalingrado no duró tanto como el de Leningrado, pero la ciudad fue testigo de una de las más feroces batallas en todo el frente oriental.
The battle for Stalingrad is a classic example of how urban areas are now used and turned into modern fortresses in battle.
Stalingrado mostró una vez más el fracaso de las tropas alemanas en su intento de cortar completamente las líneas de suministro enemigas.
What the Germans didn't do here was surround Stalingrad first and then try to reduce it. What they did was they broke into the city immediately, gained a foothold, and then tried to expand the foothold. At the same time, the Russians were on the other bank of the Volga, and they were continuing to send reinforcements through.
Con gran cantidad de tropas incorporándose a la batalla de parte de ambos bandos, la lucha se hizo cada vez más terrible.
As the Germans continued to fight for the city, the Russians turned every building in the city into a small fortress. The fights over the Red Tractor Factory, the fights over some of the other major buildings in Stalingrad are legends. The battle became a meat grinder, very similar to what happened in the Battle of Verdun.
Finalmente, en enero de 1943, el ejército alemán, a más de 1.500 millas de su patria, agotó sus refuerzos. Los contraataques soviéticos rodearon las tropas germanas. Los ejércitos rusos del norte y del este se encontraron en las llanuras de las afueras de Stalingrado, a sabiendas de que los alemanes estaban atrapados en el interior de la ciudad. El atacante se había convertido en defensor, pero Hitler no admitía la derrota.
Hitler decided there was only one option, that he would not allow anyone to withdraw. He told the defenders of Stalingrad that they would fight to the last man, and they in fact fought a very, very difficult battle, not to the last man, but until their effectiveness was no longer anything that could stop the Soviet army. And so they surrendered and the Soviets won one of the greatest victories of the war in Fortress Stalingrad.
Pero el frente oriental no fue el único escenario de asedios dramáticos durante la Segunda Guerra Mundial. En Italia, el terreno montañoso ofreció a los alemanes posiciones defensivas naturales. Los aliados se desplazaron lentamente hacia el norte de la bota italiana en dirección a Roma, a veces dependiendo de mulas donde los camiones y tanques no podían pasar. Pero su avance se detuvo en Cassino, una ciudad dominada por una abadía del siglo VI, situada en la cima de una montaña a 60 millas al sudoeste de Roma.
You could see for 8, 10, 12 miles on a clear day without any problems, so any movement in the valley floor could be observed by the Germans on the mountaintop. So that taking the town of Cassino or the monastery itself, you would be taking or trying to defeat the Germans at their strongest point.
Una brigada del Quinto Ejército de Estados Unidos intentó una ofensiva, pero fueron repelidos rápidamente por la artillería alemana y el fuego de morteros. Muchos estadounidenses creían que los soldados alemanes que dirigían este fuego devastador, encargados de calcular los blancos para la artillería, tenían su base de operaciones dentro de la abadía, que supuestamente estaba prohibida para personal militar.
I've been told since that the monastery was vacant, that there was no military forces there, but I'm convinced that they were. In fact, we were able to see reflections of binoculars. If you attempted to move during the day, and if you were not camouflaged, the Germans could literally pick you off like shooting fish in a barrel. They had to have been there because it was the focal point. It was the center of that defensive position.
La abadía no había sido atacada por el respeto de los aliados a su valor religioso e histórico, pero tras varios meses de lucha y miles de bajas, se llegó a la decisión de destruir este probable bastión alemán.
No choice but to blast it off the face of the earth. I can recall even today the feeling of elation. It started in the morning, gray, overcast, cloudy day, and we could see coming out of the south these tiny specks, and then we knew they were bombers, heavy planes, and as they approached the monastery, it filled the sky like flies or like huge birds. The sky was just full of our planes. And as they crossed over the area where they could begin to drop their bombs on that mountain, the earth rumbled. It just shook like an earthquake for probably 2 hours. It was just a happy, happy day for everybody there because we could see it disintegrate. We understood later that they were 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 feet deep inside the mountain in these caves, playing cards, sleeping, just waiting for the bombing to end. Later, on attack, trying to maneuver back up that mountain, the Germans came out of those caves underneath that monastery and cut us to pieces. It was unbelievable.
Ironically, reducing the town and the monastery to rubble made it easier for the German paratroopers who were defending the position.
Even though it was reduced to rubble, the high ground was still there. It still offered the vantage point, and now all that rubble was turned into a fortress by the Germans.
Eventualmente, los comandantes de las fuerzas aliadas se dieron cuenta de que Cassino no podría ser tomada por un ataque directo.
Ultimately, it was taken, but it was taken by virtue of another action by making the invasion of a place called Anzio, south of Rome. The purpose of that, of course, was to cut off the supplies to Cassino.
El ataque anfibio de Anzio fue detenido inicialmente, pero los estadounidenses rompieron la cabecera de playa y los alemanes se vieron en la necesidad de retirarse hacia Cassino. Este antiguo bastión de montaña había tenido un gran costo.
It was a position that we should never have attempted to have taken by frontal assault. I'm not a tactician, I know nothing of strategy, but I know that you just don't simply throw all of your forces at something that is that impenetrable.
Armas de Guerra volverá en un momento. Usted está viendo Armas de Guerra. Armas de Guerra.
En los primeros días de junio de 1944, los aliados hacían los preparativos finales para invadir las defensas alemanas construidas a lo largo de la costa francesa, conocidas como la Pared Atlántica o Fortaleza Europea.
The Atlantic Wall was a well-designed, complex obstacle. It included many different devices that were designed to destroy landing craft and then kill soldiers when they hit the beaches. Once you got onto the beaches, there were mines, barbed wire, up to the point where Germans would then have their machine gun pits and their anti-tank gun pits and their cannons.
Afortunadamente para los aliados, en 1944 el ejército alemán estaba operando en condiciones deficientes, lo que permitió a los aliados aislar y luego reducir en forma sistemática las defensas que rodeaban la pared atlántica.
The Germans had two major disadvantages by 1944. The Luftwaffe had been virtually swept from the skies, and the Allies enjoyed total air superiority. Similarly, the German Navy had been reduced to a few submarines and a few E-boats operating in the Channel and the North Sea. Neither force would be adequate to deter an Allied invasion.
The Allied plan for the assault of Fortress Europe involved a sequence that had first airborne and glider troops trying to isolate the battlefield. These troops landed the night before at key road junctions, at key river bridges. Their mission was to seize these areas and block enemy reinforcements from getting to the beachheads. The next day, a huge naval bombardment prepared the beaches. The Allied Navy expended thousands and thousands of shells against German gun emplacements. In addition to that, the air forces tried to also slow enemy reserves, destroy key bridges, and pulverize enemy formations that could be observed. So first, the beachheads areas were isolated, then they were prepared, and finally the beach assault itself occurred.
Los aliados llegaron a 5 playas diferentes en la península de Normandía: Gold, Juno, Sword, y las playas reservadas para tropas estadounidenses Omaha y Utah.
The fight to get to Omaha Beach was the worst. There we landed against a very well-prepared enemy that was defending from very good bunkers that had not been destroyed, and we took tremendous casualties on the beach. Finally, however, through the courage of many fine soldiers and engineers who went forward to blow up the obstacles, we were able to break through at Omaha Beach and finally get up to the beach wall and then continue to move through, and so the actions at Omaha were successful.
At the end of June the 6th, 5 Allied divisions were firmly ashore, and almost 50 divisions were waiting in England to reinforce them. By the end of June 1944, 1 million Allied troops had poured through the Normandy beachhead.
Eventualmente, toda Francia sería liberada y los aliados se aproximaban a las últimas líneas defensivas de Alemania.
The last obstacle toward the Allies' advance into Germany was the Siegfried Line. A series of tank obstacles, ditches, anti-personnel mines, and concrete barriers known as Dragon's Teeth, which were protected by bunkers, machine gun nests, and anti-tank guns.
La línea Siegfriedo pudo haber significado una gran amenaza para el avance de los aliados si el ejército alemán hubiese hostigado a las tropas que avanzaban con fuego de artillería pesada y armas pequeñas. Pero los germanos se encontraban en inferioridad numérica, a punto de la derrota, y no podían contrarrestar la ventaja del poder de fuego aliado.
The Siegfried Line was demolished by a combination of Allied bombing, artillery strikes, and combat engineers using satchel charges and other means of demolition.
Mientras tanto, los soviéticos avanzaban rápidamente desde el este y de hecho llegaron a Berlín antes que los aliados occidentales. La ciudad, que según los nazis resistiría más que Leningrado, cayó en cuestión de días. El sueño de Hitler de un Reich de 1000 años finalmente había terminado. Y ahora el pueblo alemán debía pagar las consecuencias de las aspiraciones demoníacas de su líder. En los años que siguieron al fin de la Segunda Guerra Mundial, el poder de la bomba atómica nunca fue utilizado en batalla, aunque su efecto devastador sobre cualquier fortificación estaba en claro. Surgieron, en cambio, varios pequeños conflictos regionales en lugares como Corea. El siguiente asedio importante de la era moderna ocurriría a finales de 1953, en un lugar llamado Bien Dien Phu, donde los franceses se enfrentaron al Bien Minh comunista.
The Battle of Dien Bien Phu is a classic example where the person who wanted to trap an enemy became trapped instead. The French wanted to win a great conventional victory against the Viet Minh, their enemy, the Vietnamese communists.
Tired of years of guerrilla warfare, the French decided they would try and lure the communists out into a battle in the open. 3 battalions of French paratroopers landed in November, overran the small communist garrison, and began fortifying the village and improving the airfield. Over the next few weeks, the garrison was reinforced to a total of 15,000 French regulars and Vietnamese loyal to the French.
Las fuerzas francesas creían poseer un poder de fuego superior y confiaban poder detener cualquier ataque comunista. Pero pronto se darían cuenta de que sus estimaciones iniciales estaban erradas.
The Vietnamese had been training their army. They had been re-equipped with weapons from China. They had increased their firepower, and they had also realized the French plan. General Giap, the leader of the Viet Minh army, planned the operation to be a battle of annihilation.
General Giap directed his assault against the airfield, and in March 1954, it was overrun. Resupply was now only possible by parachute, and many of the transport aircraft flying in were shot down by communist Vietnamese gunners, and many of the supplies, instead of falling in French hands, actually landed in the communist lines. By May of 1954, the French garrison was on the point of starvation, virtually out of ammunition, and finally fell to an overwhelming communist Vietnamese assault.
La derrota francesa en Dien Bien Phu fue una importante victoria política para los comunistas y puso fin a la intervención francesa en la región. El tratado firmado el 20 de julio de 1954 no solo terminó la dominación francesa, sino que también causó la formación de un Estado comunista en Vietnam del Norte, lo que a su vez condujo a las Fuerzas Armadas estadounidenses a la Guerra de Vietnam en 1965.
Armas de Guerra volverá en un momento. Armas de Guerra.
El conflicto de Vietnam se caracterizó principalmente por la guerra de guerrillas en la selva. Pequeños grupos de infantería y fuerzas mecanizadas perseguían y luego enfrentaban al enemigo. Pero Vietnam también presenció una batalla convencional. El asedio del complejo estadounidense de Ken San en las nubladas colinas cercanas a Vietnam del Norte.
Khe Sanh was a strategic city in Quang Tri province, dominating Highway 9, a crucial resupply route. Garrisoned by 5,000 United States Marines in January '68, the city was surrounded by up to 20,000 North Vietnamese regulars.
The Vietnamese communists were touting the slogan that Khe Sanh would be another Dien Bien Phu. General Giap, the man who had planned the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, was supposedly the man who was planning the Battle of Khe Sanh. The United States saw Khe Sanh as a great opportunity to win a firepower battle over its enemy. And this was the same concept that the French had initially had with Dien Bien Phu.
Sin embargo, a pesar de la similitud del terreno entre Khe Sanh y Dien Bien Phu, las batallas fueron muy distintas, por muchas razones. Una de ellas fue que los infantes de marina habían ocupado las colinas que rodeaban el complejo.
I think we needed to hold the high ground. If they'd have taken the hill we were on, and we were the hill they apparently tried to take the most, Hill 861, if they'd have taken that, they would have had 881 cut off from Khe Sanh, and that air flights wouldn't be able to go right over the top of the thing because they would set up their anti-aircraft positions on that. I think it was important to hold those hills.
Otra de las razones era que las tropas estadounidenses, a diferencia de las francesas anteriormente, sí poseían mayor poder de fuego que los norvietnamitas en términos de artillería en tierra. Y lo que es más importante, contaban con superioridad aérea.
We had total air superiority and total command of the air. Our fighters and our fighter bombers flew countless missions against the North Vietnamese army, just pulverizing the hills around Khe Sanh.
There are massive numbers of B-52 strikes. Each B-52 can carry 72 750-pound bombs. And I know from personal experience when when you see one of these strikes. It's awe-inspiring.
I recall looking up in the air trying to see if I could spot the airplanes, the B-52s dropping the bombs. I could not see the B-52s, but I heard the bombs cascading down, and they would just make a horrendous roar. You could hear for miles and miles.
El mayor poder de fuego de las tropas estadounidenses no solo detuvo varios ataques comunistas, sino que permitió que prosiguieran los vitales suministros aéreos, aunque la vía de abastecimiento aéreo de Khe Sanh no era la más segura. Los alimentos, agua y municiones que traían las tripulaciones eran el fluido vital del complejo, y los infantes de marina en tierra ciertamente apreciaban los sacrificios realizados por los pilotos.
I believe that the pilots that flew into there had to have quite a bit of courage. I recall at one point where I was filling sandbags with my squad members, one of them looking up and yelling, "Hey, look at that." And I looked around in time to see a Silver C-130 flying in, and it was fully engulfed in flames, and I saw it go down on the runway. Apparently the crew had been killed, but I can vividly remember seeing that plane come around on fire and then hitting the runway.
A pesar de las frecuentes tragedias, los suministros continuaron llegando. Los bombarderos dejaban caer su carga mortal y los infantes de marina mantenían sus posiciones. El complejo fue atacado desde todos los flancos, pero nunca estuvo en grave peligro, lo que hace que muchos duden de la existencia de un asedio en el sentido estricto del término.
My feelings about Khe Sanh being besieged, even at the time and now as I look back on it, I never felt that we were besieged in the sense that we were totally cut off. But I also knew we couldn't just get out of our positions and stroll around out in the mountainside either.
Los infantes de marina y otras fuerzas habían rechazado un fuerte ataque y podían clamar una completa victoria militar. Sin embargo, las ramificaciones simbólicas de este asedio hablan de una historia distinta.
The Vietnamese were fighting for political reasons, for strategic goals, not necessarily tactical victories. And Khe Sanh was remembered as a siege, and many people in the United States learned the wrong lesson from Khe Sanh, thinking that we were on the defensive. It showed us barely winning a battle against an enemy who was attacking us versus us attacking the enemy, bringing the war to an end.
Casi 20 años después de Vietnam, Estados Unidos se vio envuelto de nuevo en un conflicto sobre terreno poco conocido. Esta vez fueron las arenas del Medio Oriente.
During the tactical operations in Iraq, we had to fight against many modern-day fortresses. Those fortresses were in the form of anti-tank ditches, bunkers, bunker complexes, and defensive positions built on a grand scale.
They had months to dig holes, dig trenches, set in mines, and we had been briefed extensively on the capabilities of their defense. We expected to see a real knockdown, drag-out fight.
Afortunadamente, gracias al uso de fotos de satélite increíblemente precisas, las fuerzas de la coalición tuvieron tiempo de practicar el ataque a las defensas iraquíes.
We had great overhead imagery of what we were facing. We took that overhead imagery and we sent it back to the deserts of California, and they built the Iraqi Siegfried Line in the National Training Center. They then went out there with the very best that they could take to the National Training Center, and they practiced reducing that obstacle and going through it over and over and over again until they had it all right. Then they filmed it. Then they sent the film to us in Saudi Arabia as we were training for this thing. Then we built our own Iraqi obstacles using the models that they gave us and the overhead imagery. We built them in the desert, and we practiced it over and over and over again. Not against a generic obstacle system, but against what we knew we would be facing in detail.
Gracias a la increíble preparación y a la superioridad aérea total, la ofensiva terrestre fue efectuada de forma casi perfecta.
We expected a Siegfried Line, but ended up not finding one there.
The ease with which coalition forces were able to breach the Iraqi defenses during Desert Storm demonstrated yet again that the reliance upon Maginot Line defenses is outmoded in an age of maneuver warfare.
They used the engineers to clear the minefields. They used the engineers to breach the berm, and then the tanks would go through, armored personnel carriers, and then it became a war of mobility. And the Iraqis never could fight a war of mobility the way we fight a war of mobility.
El impresionante éxito de las fuerzas de la coalición y la relativa facilidad con la que destruyeron las defensas iraquíes hacen abrigar dudas sobre la naturaleza de las fortificaciones defensivas en el futuro.
Mobility and the ability to hide are going to play a bigger role in the battlefield than to fix something in the position.
In the future, with the development of directed energy weapons, lasers, and other such devices, we may find ourselves reintroducing a new series of forts and fortresses in order to protect vast areas that are defended with laser weapons.
A pesar de los avances tecnológicos del futuro, no queda duda de que la amarga lucha entre atacante y defensor continuará.